long ago, I had a chance to chat with Lorenzo Lebrija, who's the founder of TryTank, innovation lab in the church. He'll tell you more about that. What's intriguing is how innovation requires success and failure in order to learn. And Lorenzo will give some examples of that and talk about how churches big and small can learn through innovation and grow the church to make more disciples for Jesus Christ. Hey, Lorenzo, good to see you today. How are you?
I am very well, thank you. We're all dealing with many things that are coming at us at the same time, but I think all things considered, and thanks be to God, all is well.
Where are you today?
Palm Springs, California, which is home. And I keep telling people, if you have to shelter in place, there are worse places to be sheltering in, So, and my home happens to be right on a golf course. So, like I said, I'm not complaining much.
So you and I first met in person, I think, sitting in a pew next to each other at Peter Eaton's ordination at a very full, very hot cathedral in Miami.
That's right. It was humid. It was hot.
And I've enjoyed staying in touch with you since then. And I was especially interested to hear that you were going to work for something called TryTank. And I wonder if you could tell our viewers a little bit more about what is TryTank and what are you doing there?
Sure, absolutely. So TriTech is the experimental laboratory for church growth and innovation. And generally, when I say that to people, they're like, I totally understand the words you just told me, but in the order you just put them, I've never heard them that way, right? You don't often hear about church growth and church innovation sort of as something that we're working toward. And so and that's the whole point of this, is that we wanted to be intentional about this work. And so Virginia Theological Seminary and General Theological Seminary came together to create. We wanted to do more than a think tank. We wanted to do more than just put out ideas into the universe and into the world so that people could take them. We wanted to say, what if we actually take those ideas and actually try them? What would it look like if we weren't just a think tank, but if we were, well, here it comes, a TriTank? And that was the whole point of this, was that we would actually take the ideas and become a laboratory that was actually out in the world doing it, trying it. So we see ourselves as a proof of concept laboratory. The work that we do is not meant to be something that we keep to ourselves, certainly. And it's also not meant to be something that we just put out there and hope that people will try. Because part of the problem, you see, these aren't necessarily like, oh my God, this is the best thing that's ever happened. Nobody in the history of humanity has ever thought about this idea. The reality, though, is that all of us who have ever done ministry, whether lay or ordained, have at some point or another said, what if we did this the other way? But we just don't have the time or the resources to go and figure it out and actually try it and experiment. And so that's what we said. It's like, what if there was such a place where we could actually come up with those ideas, and instead of going through 22 different iterations of figuring out how to get an idea approved and then maybe trying it, or maybe we don't have time, or maybe, what if we just said, what if there was a place that would come up with an idea quickly and would try it right away to see if there was a there? That right. We thought was a way of trying to follow where the Spirit is leading us in this new way of being church in the world. And so that's what we created. And now, about 18 months old into this, we've done 55 experiments, wow. Some with success and some with spectacularly fun failures, but all of it holy, all of it centered on Jesus, all of it centered on trying to be the best church that we can be in the world today.
That's cool. And what I love about it is when you have, as you said, when you have an experiment that's a success, that seems to work, you tell that story, and you've had a couple that were sort of resounding failures, and you tell those stories too. And I love that because I think it changed. I think one of the reasons people don't try things is we're embarrassed that what if it fails? And of course the answer is, well, you learn stuff and just don't do that again. Do something else next time.
Yeah, we are failing at a rate for the ratio of failure to success at this point is for every 3 failures, we have 1 that's qualified as success, more or less, which is not bad. It actually should be higher, if you ask me, because the fact that we're not failing in bigger numbers, probably I tend to think means we're not pushing the envelope far enough out there. Yeah. We're not really going out there and just like saying, okay, we have in all of this, if we just keep in mind that we're not going to break the church of God, you know, there was only one person that needed to be on a cross to save it, and he's done that work. The
Yep.
rest of it is up to us to try to catch up. So if we just go out there and try, and so that's part of our charge in the world, is to also fail, but what I call it, holy failure. As long as we continue to have God and Jesus at our center, in other words, as long as we're meaning to do good for the church, not just failing for the sake of failing, as long as we're actually trying to be a better church while doing this, that if we fail, that's okay. And if
Right.
we need to celebrate that. We need to figure out what could we have done different? Is there a way that, is there, in any failure, is there a way that we can iterate a little bit and fix it? It's like, oh, that's where we went wrong. We chose yellow instead of red. We should have gone with red. And if we just make that change, should we go out there and try it? Or have we decided? So I'll give you one of my quintessential failure story. So if you've ever been to a soul cycles are these spin gyms, right? They're group fitness classes that are held in a gymnasium that's really not a gym. It's just a place where people gather, and there's bicycles, and it's just a studio for spinning. But when you enter, the room is darkened. There are candles on the wall. It says, "Find your soul." And then when the person starts speaking with you and leading you through the class, they say things like, there's no yesterday, there's no tomorrow, there's only this day that's been created for you. And I was like, you know, you throw in a Jesus in it, you're giving me a sermon right there. And we said, well, maybe people who are not going to church, maybe they're finding their spirituality, their sense of connectedness through group fitness classes. So what if we took a group fitness class and actually made it a liturgical experience where it was something that was, yes, you would sort of get the sermon throughout the class, and then at the end we would all sort of, while we're sweaty, sit there and do Eucharist together and break bread together and be a sacramental community. And we said, well, let's go ahead and try it. And so we tried it for 8 weeks out in Rhode Island, in a place that was quintessentially set up to have, you know, this succeed. And we tried it. And I always tell the story, you know, we ran about 160,000 ads on Facebook, or they were seen about 160,000 times. About 29,000 people saw them and interacted with them. So each person saw it multiple times. And of those people, about 1,200 actually like shared it or liked it or engaged with the ad, which is higher than normal engagement rates for Facebook. So far it's like, yeah, this is going to be great. This is going to be awesome. And then of those people, 12 people actually signed up for the class. I was like, this is going to be the best. We can only actually take 10. Should we send someone home already? And of course, nobody, not one of those 12 showed up, but we had their data. We were able to call and speak to them. And here's what we found. Our fundamental sort of theory, which is that people who are not in church are likely finding that sense of community, that sense of belonging from group fitness classes. What we didn't sort of take from that at that point was that, and they're already finding it in a group fitness class somewhere else. So this was no different than me setting up another church and saying, come to my church instead of that one. We were saying, come to our group fitness class instead of the other one. So we were sort of the same sort of competition. But we learned that by doing it. We learned that. And so now what we've learned from that quote unquote failure is that people are finding spirituality elsewhere. And so that informs other experiments as we go forward. That informs when we look at it and we're like, all right, so what do we learn from that we can now, that fundamental truth that we've discovered, how might we be influenced by that? And that influences here and there in the 55 experiments. It all began with one experiment, the Alexa experiment, and it has sort of grown from there like a web, but all of them informed the other. We learned from Alexa how to do Facebook well. And so we did a Facebook masterclass. And from there, we learned how we can really do it well and how we can do the lookalike audiences and all of that. And so little by little, one informs the other, which informs the other, which is why telling the story is important to us.
Right.
Because we don't have the wisdom of the church. And so the more that we can share what we're learning with others, then all of a sudden you, Scott, look at it and you're like, oh, and what if we, and bingo, whatever that follows, that what if we ... and fill in the blank, that's where the innovation in the church comes in.
Yeah.
That's where the true growth can happen.
That's cool. So if people want to learn more about the experiments, you've written about some of them or all of them on the TryTank website. Is that right?
Yeah, on trytank.org, trytank.org, on the TriTank website, there's a couple of ways that we do this. One is every month I put out a newsletter, and pandemics notwithstanding, it generally is just about the experiments. And I try to be as open and honest in that newsletter, saying we've bumped into a problem here and we don't know exactly how to do it. Does anybody have any ideas? And I just put out the call. And generally, people just hit reply and say, like, have you considered this? Have you considered that? So that's one way that people find out. Once an experiment is concluded, done, we do try to tell the final story. Yeah. The story that says, this is what we were trying to achieve. This is what we, as best as we can tell, this is what happened. And here's a little bit of analysis as to why we think what happened, and what might be some of the bulleted takeaways that we can take from here that it will inform other things. The same way, for example, if I can give you another example, sure. we just did an experiment during the COVID pandemic called Dial a Priest, and what we saw as the issue was people were dying. People were dying, and because of the sheer number of people that were dying, and because of the contagion being so contagious, they weren't able to have people with them as they were dying. So this was bad for the person dying. This was bad for the family that couldn't be there by their bedside, nor could they pray with them. And this was bad also even for the doctors and nurses who were there. I spoke to some of them during this who just told me, like, the fact that we have nothing that we can do for this person, it also affects us. It just breaks us a little bit each time that there comes a point where you're like, there's nothing we can do. What we also learned, so what we did is we said, what if we created, and this was based on the story, a priest had done this, and we're like, hey, why don't we formalize this where you can do the ministration at the time of death, which is from the Book of Common Prayer. What if we could do that by telephone with people, so that even as someone either was about to be intubated, so that would be generally those who were intubated, very few, small percentage came off the ventilators later. Now it's a little bit better just by numbers. But what if we were able to do it right before they intubated, or at the moment when we thought the person was going to die, what if the nurse could call into a phone number? What if there was one phone number that they could reach priests, so that if the chaplain was not available, if their local priest was not available, they could get someone 24 hours a day. And so from idea to having 100 volunteer retired priests on a brand new phone system that they could, one phone number that reached 100 people all throughout the country. From idea to having that live was 7 days. So finding the technology, finding the volunteers, training the volunteers, having it all ready and starting to advertise the phone number was 7 days, which proved that the church can be nimble. When there is something that happens that calls on us to be someone or something in the world, the church can do it quickly. That was the first thing we learned from it. The second thing we certainly have learned from that experiment is that we have a lot of retired clergy with decades of experience that are willing, and not only are they willing, they're ready to step up and help. When we put out the call for this, they stepped up certainly. But I think also there's just such wisdom that now there's going to be other experiments where we're like, how can we use that? We have this resource of our retired clergy who want to help, who have all this wisdom. How do we tap into that? How do we use that? That's important. We need to do that, more of that, especially now when baby boomers, right, are stepping away from churches and positions, but they have all this wisdom. So the Dial a Priest experiment probably is on it. The calls have dropped tremendously. We're down to just 10 volunteers because we have to pay per each one that's on the call. We're only getting, last week it was less than 12 calls that we've gotten. So we're probably coming toward the end of the experiment itself. Also, the need is not as great in hospitals, their own chaplains and systems. We also discovered, of course, that there are hospitals that have certain regulations. They don't just let any phone number be called for a final, administration, because you don't know who's on the other side of that phone, and you don't want to. And also keeping in mind that generally the people who quote unquote want last rites tend to be very specific about who gives those last rites. If you're Roman Catholic and you think that the last rites must count, quote unquote, air quotes here, then you want them from a Roman Catholic priest. And so
Yeah.
having an Episcopal, although we're your closest cousins, it may not necessarily be what they're looking for. So we learned from that. But I think for us, the two main sort of takeaways that we've taken from that is this ability to really quickly be able to do something as a church, as a greater church. And two, this resource that we have in our retired clergy that I hope we'll be able to tap into for other things. Maybe it's one of the experiments that we have right now. It's on hold until we're all able to be back in our churches and congregations. But it's called a virtual supply preacher. We have a lot of small churches in this country. You saw the numbers that came out last fall, right? We have more churches that have 10 or fewer people than we have churches that have 300 or more people. And
Yeah.
a lot of those small, really small places may not have a full-time priest, may not even be able to afford a supply clergy because there's 10 people that gathered, and God bless them that they do that. And they do their best, and most of the time they end up doing the morning office, which is awesome. But for the reflection, for what we would consider the homily, the preaching, what they end up doing is they end up reading, and they might read something from sermons at work. They might read. I've even heard a story of one person that actually read an article from Reader's Digest, and nothing against Reader's Digest, but I'm going to guess that the Jesus count, as my old homiletics professor would have said, the Jesus count on that sermon was probably pretty low. So what if we were able to use technology, now that we know all of us can see through the internet and see each other, what if we use that technology to bring in a well-crafted preacher, someone who has a lot of experience, maybe some of these retired clergy, that could be, quote unquote, beamed in to that congregation, just roll up a big screen TV that's not that expensive and actually play a well-crafted, biblically centered sermon from a good preacher. So that's something that we're going to be trying once we're back in our building. So yeah, like I said, all of them sort of inform each other as we do this work.
That's pretty cool. So now a lot of, as you said, that we have mostly small churches. The median Sunday attendance is 55 people or something, or it might even be less now, 52, 53, somewhere in there.
Keeps dropping.
What's that?
Keeps dropping, that number.
Yeah, no, exactly. It keeps slowly easing down. And a lot of the resources that get created for the Episcopal Church are only conceived of for big churches, unfortunately. So I wonder what you might say to the leaders, the lay leaders, the clergy person who's probably part-time at some of those smaller churches, either in terms of available resources or more likely even a lot of those churches in my anecdotal experience are they're sort of white-knuckled, hanging on for survival. They're worried about just hanging on. They want to be there, and so when people get into survival mode, in my experience, a lot of people tend to get to resist innovation. They don't want to take risks. What if it fails? Let's rely on something that we know works. What would you say to some of those leaders to think about innovation when you're a little church and you're worried about getting through next year?
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is thank you. Thank you for hanging on to that church, because if it weren't for those who are hanging on for dear life and not letting it go away, not just letting it close, means that we have a church in that location. So,
yes.
So a big thank you for that, just as a member of the clergy in this church, and that we acknowledge that is hard work. So we don't diminish it, we don't take away from it, and God bless you for doing that work. And certainly, I keep in mind, I'm cognizant of the fact that the margin of error seems so much thinner in a small congregation that doesn't have a lot of resources, that doesn't have. So I'm cognizant of that, and I'm also very cognizant of fear, right? So I would just remind them, we're not going to break it. We're not going to break the church, and there are some things that we have learned that have what innovation is to one person may not be innovative to somebody else. It just means it's new to you, right? It means it might be new to your congregation. We have learned, one of the experiments that we're doing is called the Listening Project. And we are talking to 100 leaders in the church who have grown and maintained the growth in their congregation.
Wow.
And
Okay.
the thought of what we wanted to do there was, after like 20 conversations, we'll get some anecdotes, which will be great at cocktail parties and good little stories to tell. And I'm about to tell you some of those. Then when we talk to about 50 of them, we'll probably be able to put together like the 7 habits of highly effective church growers, you know?
Yeah.
A real goal here is that when we talk to 100, and that's why 100 is the number, that we'll find some surprises, some statistical anomalies that don't make sense in the aggregate, but you look at it and you're like, I don't know why, but 80% of these people are having oatmeal for breakfast. Is that something we should be doing in seminaries? Just start feeding people oatmeal?
Yeah.
Because, and I joke about the oatmeal, right? But there probably are some things that they're doing that the vast majority of them are doing that we can learn from. And this is where I'm going to give you some anecdotes. We know that people who have gone into a congregation where they tell the congregation, I am your chief spiritual officer. I am not here to be the sexton. I am not here to run a small business. We will all do that together as a community. But you have hired me to be the chief spiritual officer of this place, and that's where my focus will be. So they tend to be very focused on Sunday, on their sermons being complete, and exploring the scriptures together and how they impact us today, rather than I got so busy with everything else having to do with the administration of this place that I was only able to write my sermon on Sunday morning, and I didn't really give it a lot of thought. There's a difference between the two, and it shows. These people who are chief spiritual officers also pray more regularly. Prayer is a constant in their own lives. So as one of them told us when we were talking to him, is like, you wouldn't ask your brain surgeon when she comes into your room right before the operation to see how you're doing. You wouldn't say, oh, while you're here, could you go ahead and also fix the bathroom because it's broken? You would say, like, how can we make this the most successful operation it can be? You would be focused on that. So why is it that we take highly trained people who are trained in the spiritual stuff and we ask them to do almost everything but the spiritual stuff? We're like, you'll get to that. Maybe because you're so well trained, you don't need a lot of time. What we need you to do is run meetings, run committees, do this administrative task, do all that, and fix the bathroom, and then worry about Sunday. So that emphasis on Sunday and the spirituality has been very important. To that point, the second point I want to make on that, they told us that some of them, one of the things, and this was one of those like surprises that we didn't go in there asking this question, but once we heard it like 3 or 4 times from different people, we're like, maybe we do need to ask this question. They went in and they were intentional about cutting down on the amount of time for the peace.
Wow.
And you look at it and you're like,
right.
Why would they do that? And then they explained, they're like, think about the awkwardness. If you're a new person that comes in and it's time for the peace, you're like, oh, I'm going to say the peace to the 4 people around me. But particularly in smaller churches where everybody goes to greet everybody else, that person that doesn't know anyone has now had these 4 minutes of awkwardness. Of, oh, I don't belong here. And it's not intentional. No one has said to the person, you don't belong here. But for those 4 minutes when they stood there and maybe somebody came by and said hi, but they're like, this is really awkward. I don't really know anybody. We created this sense of awkwardness instead of a sense of welcoming and you belong just as much.
No, that makes total sense. When I was in parish ministry at 2 parishes I served, I sent out people when we were working on our welcoming culture, and I asked them to go visit an Episcopal church that they'd never been and where they didn't know anybody. And they all had the same experience. You know, I couldn't figure out what door to go in. The peace was awkward. I asked them, I said, go to church and go to coffee hour. Everyone reported, went out to coffee hour, nobody talked to me. And then they come back and realize, oh, wow, what if we're doing this too? So I think that makes a difference. The other thing that occurs to me, I wonder if this is correct, if you think this is right or not, is the priest who's willing to have that conversation about the peace sees that the liturgy, the point of the liturgy isn't to make people feel better. It's to call us into a deeper relationship with one another following Jesus. And so that priest is willing to, as a leader, take some pushback for stuff that they see needs to get done. And a lot of clergy are, a lot of us are people pleasers.
Yeah.
And we have a sense of, well, I wish I could do this or that, but I'm too afraid to because I know people won't like it. And the priest who's willing to say, okay, ixnay on the peace, is willing to take some slings and arrows.
And if you think about it, though, even with the slings and arrows of such a decision, it is very much a teachable moment, because the piece is not meant to replace or be about like the coffee hour that will come
No,
afterwards.
exactly.
The piece was meant to be that whoever's next to you,
Yeah.
hopefully it's someone you're not getting along with right now, that you still have to give that person the peace of God. That's what it's about. It's about sharing that I am giving you, even if we're right now not peaceful with each other, that is now transcended by God's peace.
Yes. No, exactly. So, any other ones? So we've got the peace and
Virtual supply preachers that will
yep,
be
yep.
available. We have another one that we're working on that I think will be interesting. We're doing this one with the Diocese of Pennsylvania, particularly for smaller churches. We tend to replicate our efforts a lot. And so what if we, instead of having to create a bulletin for each congregation, what if we had like an administrative hub that was able to do a lot of the work for a whole
Yeah.
bunch of smaller churches? In the Church of England, they call this a mixed economy, where more resourced congregations, right, bigger churches that have more resources, are able to be like, you know what, I think that the person who puts together our bulletin could also do the 20 copies that are needed for the church down the street, and that would be a huge help for them, so they don't have that expense, so that they don't have to figure, because it takes time to do it. Our person's already doing it. Why duplicate the effort? So we're trying to figure out what are some of those low-hanging fruits that we all do, but that we can share in the doing of them.
That makes sense.
And so we're in the Diocese of Pennsylvania. We found 4 churches. This was actually their idea. We just sort of said like, yes, because if that works and we can sort of figure out the framework for it, then let us share it with the world as to how it can work in other places. And so we want to be able to do that. So that's like, if there are 90 congregations in a diocese, odds are you have 90 different accounting systems, you have 90 different bulletins that are being made, you have 90. It's like, why are we doing that to ourselves? It's not necessary, and it doesn't make fiscal, time-wise, it just doesn't make sense that we do that. So let's try to figure out ways. So administrative hubs is one way that we're doing that also. And I'll just finish off with one last one that I think would be of interest to particularly smaller churches. This one, we're doing it with our friends in the Diocese of Indiana.
Indianapolis, yeah.
Indianapolis, yeah. Where what they're doing is we have a lot of home visitors that take the Eucharist, 2 people that are out there. And we've created a little home sermon. It's 3 minutes on purpose. It's 3 minutes so that when somebody, and it's from a priest, she does a great job with them. And so it's called Good News on the Go. And goodnewsonthego.org is where they can find it. And every week there's a little 3-minute sermon, so that if somebody's getting communion, there can be, you can go out there, you can read the scripture together, show the 3-minute mini sermon, have a little conversation about it, have an Our Father, and then do the communion. Then it's not just, hey, we're kind of on my route and I'm just here to give you communion real quick, or it gives them less to prepare. It gives them a little sermon that is, again, biblically and centered, and it makes it easier for people to bring the good news, not just the actual Eucharist, which is so beautiful and needed, but also the actual good news of Scripture to them as well.
That's cool. So we're nearing the end of our time. For folks who are listening who are wondering, can growth really happen in my church, or can we really do new stuff? Any parting words of advice or encouragement for folks thinking about innovation or growth?
Absolutely, yes, you can do it. And sometimes what you need in order to get the courage to face the fear of anything that might be new, or to be willing to, one of the advantages, if you will, of a small church that it sort of seems like, oh, that was circling the drain, is that, believe it or not, those are generally the ones that are also willing to try more. Because those are the ones that recognize that if we don't do something different, we're the ones who are going to go down with the ship, and we're going to end up closing here. And rather than doing that, we can be faithful to our call as Christians and as a church if we just say yes rather than no more often. If we're willing to try things, if we're willing to do it. And so just find someone who's like you. That's how you handle the fear. Because if you can find another congregation If you can find kindred spirits through TryTank, we now have 1,400 people that get our newsletter and get ideas from there, and we're always seeking for partners to join us in there. I make myself available just as a conversation partner with people, and I've had so many conversations with people. It's like, so I'm trying to do this, or I'm thinking about this. What do you think? And we walk it through together for an hour or something, and they feel better about it. It's not that I have that much more wisdom to impart. It's the fact that they were able to share it with someone who was willing to walk with them and be a conversation partner in that idea. That makes a difference. So even if you're not the one who's in the small church or in the church that needs to do this, even if you're on the other where you might be a resource church that's already doing innovation, then be in your own diocese a conversation partner for somebody else who may want to try something different, and they just don't know that they can do it. They just need someone to walk. And I'll finish with this. It's like that old story of, you can be lost and it feels awful. You can be lost with your friend. You're just as lost, but it doesn't feel as awful.
Right.
I am a firm believer that is why Jesus sent us out 2 by 2, because doing the work alone is much harder. Do it with a friend. Do it with someone that you can be in conversation, or be that friend to someone that's trying to walk that walk.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for your time and these encouraging stories and interesting experiments. Folks can go to TryTank.org to stay in touch and get in touch and read about experiments. And when this pandemic is behind us, I look forward to seeing you at some random cathedral or church meeting.
We'll be next to each other sweating, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And
it was
again,
humid that day. It was so hot in Miami. Who consecrates a bishop in the middle of summer in Miami? We should need to think that through.
It was crazy hot. And it was not a short service, but it was a good time, and God was praised, and we got to meet, so that made it worthwhile. Anyway, thanks again, Lorenzo. It's awesome to talk to you, and I'll see you around.
My pleasure. Thank you, and thanks, everyone.